Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the day two of the second half of the Carnegie Middle East Center annual conference. And let me begin by thanking the Carnegie Middle East Center and our colleagues in Beirut for bringing us to Lebanon and for hosting this conference. And we've seen the last 2 days, day and a half, of some really important conversations and discussions. And today I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to moderate this panel on the topic of the new pivot, shifting power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. A warm welcome to also those of you who are joining us virtually from across the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Before I turn to the panel for this conversation, I just wanted to provide a little bit of introduction to the panel itself. Being here the last day and a half, I've had a lot of conversations and questions on what really is the Indo-Pacific, and I'm looking forward to getting into some of the conversations. But just to start off, I think the Indo-Pacific today is the new theater for geopolitics and competition, and there has certainly been many questions about this concept, and as it covers huge geographies. Between, I would say, 2016 and today, there has been strong discussions and debates on the utility of the concept, what it means, who is part of it, who isn't part of it, and what happens to other concepts that predates the Indo-Pacific, such as the Asia-Pacific. A lot of nations today, from the United States to Japan to India, France, United Kingdom, South Korea, a lot of the ASEAN nations, as of last week, Canada, and others all have an Indo-Pacific strategy, an outlook, or a vision. It gives the theater a legitimacy that cannot be ignored in foreign policy engagements. Although the United States Indo-Pacific strategy receives the most attention and for obvious and understandable reasons, the concept does predate Washington's own tilt to the Indo-Pacific. There are discussions and debates of how far back does it go, but you can find reference to the Indo-Pacific today geographically. It's defined differently by different nations, but a more accepted definition is perhaps the eastern coast of Africa to the western shores of America, which encompasses the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. And some references to what the Indo-Pacific constitutes dates back to the 1920s and in some German literature. But then in the post-1945 world, and perhaps in the more contemporary world, Shinzo Abe is credited, the then Prime Minister of Japan, for the concept of the Indo-Pacific, when in 2007 he spoke at the Indonesian Parliament about the confluence of the two seas, really referring to the Indian and the Pacific Oceans and the way business and commerce, trade, but also human interactions transcends between the two oceans across vast areas. The Australian white paper in 2013 was perhaps the first time that a government had formally defined their strategic space and their strategic outlook in the world in the form of Indo-Pacific. Again, a nation with a coast each on the Indian Ocean, Indian and the Pacific Ocean. Which encompasses a lot of key subregions and connects and areas that are connected by the Indian and the Pacific Oceans, which had come to be viewed in continental silos or in key subregional silos after the Cold War. And today it encompasses, of course, Africa, Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. Indo-Pacific is also not home to just one power or one or two power. It's home to big powers, middle powers, small powers, and the topic that is dear to me is and the role of islands, small islands, and the agency of it. In the last couple of developments in the last couple of years, and perhaps in the last 4 to 5 years, because of those developments, mostly concerning US and China, the Indo-Pacific today has come to be understood as the theater for competition between US and China, and the new space for China to build its presence, its influence, and engagements across different countries in the Pacific, and what it means for global, what it means for the world, what it means for geopolitics, and what it means for foreign policy priorities for different nations. But the Indo-Pacific is much more and much wider and goes beyond this competition between United States and China. And with this, I'm really delighted today to be moderating this panel and welcome our panelists to this conversation to discuss some of the key issues in the Pacific and how different nations are viewing some of their priorities, complexities, challenges, and perceptions. I'm joined today by Evan Feigenbaum, who is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment, also my direct boss, by Yuki Tatsumi, who's Senior Fellow and Co-Director of the Japan Program at the Stimson Center, and joining me in person is Sana Hashmi, who's Postdoctoral Fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation based in Taipei. I want to start with an overview because of the conversations that we've had in terms of what really are the different perspectives on this region. And for that, Evan, if I may turn to you first to provide sort of the overview on the conversation in Washington about the Indo-Pacific to set the stage to the primary concerns or areas the administration that ought to think about it but aren't. I'll come back to you for a regional perspective, but Indo-Pacific is not really a conversation that is very prevalent in the Middle East, and I thought for the audience here, it might be useful to have an understanding on how Washington is viewing it and what is the conversation in Washington to that, Evan?
Great, thanks. Well, first of all, Darshana, I'm hearing a lot of echo.
We hear you fine, I think. Is that...
Okay, I'm going to turn my volume down. Even in this age of Zoom, 3 years into the pandemic, we are still struggling a little bit with this. Okay. In any case, Darshana, thank you for the intro. Let me apologize to everybody in the audience for not being able to make it to Beirut. And let me thank my colleagues at the Kerr Middle East Center. I miss you all, but it's good to see you virtually. Darshana, I guess I'd answer that question in 3 quick bites. First, if I can, I just want to offer a reflection on what you just said, because I think it gets at some of the perversity of the debate in Washington. You know, the Indo-Pacific is a term that's emerged in the American debate about the region within the very recent lifetime of my career. And Yuki will confirm this because she's based in Washington too. It's about 10 years ago. It's basically in the 7 to 10 year time frame you started to hear this term bandied about a lot more. And in a way, it says more about the perverse legacy of the Cold War and about how Americans think about their positioning in the region, that the concept itself caused so much debate. Because if you think about the history of Asia over a couple of thousand years, the Indo-Pacific in a geographic sense was essentially the natural order of things. You can read books by Sugata Bose, the great historian of the Indian Ocean at Harvard, and you can read that for centuries, essentially, maritime fleets, fishing fleets from South Asia plied the Indian Ocean, went into Southeast Asian waters. Even Americans, with the great clipper ships of the late 1700s, the 1800s, had integrated business plans where these clipper ships were sailing from places like Salem, Massachusetts, to ports in India, and then to ports in China beyond. So the natural order of things for a couple of thousand years was essentially an integrated geography where court rituals, trade, interchange, the great interchange of people and religions all took place. What changed that, and I think introduced what I called a lot of perversity, was essentially the Cold War, because we entered a period of time where Southeast Asians essentially picked sides. The United States has 2 treaty allies in the region, Thailand and the Philippines, that basically chose sides in the Cold War contest. Many other countries, South Vietnam, Cambodia under Lon Nol, these countries also picked sides. And meanwhile, India in South Asia essentially refused to pick a side, and after 1971 leaned, if anything, to the Soviet side. So the Cold War disconnected some of these patterns, and this is true even in other parts of Central Asia. If you think about the former Soviet countries of Central Asia, they became part of Russia during the Tsarist period, but you still had natural patterns of trade and interchange with China during the Qing dynasty, during the Republican period. And so it was the Sino-Soviet split, the erection of very rigid borders that really changed that. So I think part of what's been happening over the last decade is a return to a natural geography that really defined the region for decades. And because the United States wasn't really central to that, the US has had to find ways to graft strategic concepts onto this reemerging geography as some of these patterns and interconnections begin to reemerge. Now, the good news, I think, is that the US is thinking in a more comprehensive way, not just geographically, but conceptually and strategically. The bad news, and your question begins to hint at this, is that I think, since you asked me what the conversation in Washington is, it's about China first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. And unfortunately for the United States, the strategic class, of which I'm a card-carrying member, but also the political class, and to a growing extent our regulatory class, tend to refract nearly everything in the region through the prism of the US-China competition. And that's unfortunate for a few reasons. The first is, quite obviously, there are more than two players in this part of the world. Not everything is about the United States and China. And if I can be blunt about that, for all that the US and China are different from each other politically, economically, ideologically, strategically, they are the same in one respect. Basically, they're both strategic narcissists who think that everything is essentially about them and their competition. Meanwhile, and maybe this begins to set up my fellow panelists, the rest of the region also has not just agency, but is driving a lot of the processes, diplomatic, economic, things like trade agreements, that are really setting standards, writing rules, and defining new norms for the region. So the problem the United States has in trying to fit itself into a conception of Indo-Pacific, you can see this in stark relief in something like the trade space. There are 3 trade agreements now in Asia, the so-called Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or RCEP, and the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement called DEPA. And the United States is on the outside of not one, not two, but all 3 of those agreements that are going to set standards in this region for the next generation. And you know who else is on the outside of all 3 of those? India. So, in this trade space, the largest economy in the Indo and the largest economy in the Pacific are both missing in action. And if you don't have an Indo and you don't have a Pacific, then essentially you're back to the centrality of Asian countries. And so the United States, I think, is wrestling with how to think about its own role in the region at a time when it is less central than it was outside the security realm. At any time since the mid-1990s. And, in the security realm, because every country in the region fears Chinese power and fears Chinese coercion, the American centrality is guaranteed as far as my eyes can see. But the United States has been a leader in this part of the world, not just because it's a security provider, it's a standard setter, it's been a demand source. And as those things wane, and as the United States withdraws itself, for example, from things like standard setting trade agreements, the conversation here, as you put it, is becoming increasingly disconnected from the realities in the region in which Asian countries themselves, in both the Indo and the Pacific parts of Asia, are defining a new reality. And so I've been very critical of American policy in a lot of ways, because I think the US needs to think much more comprehensively about its role and about the issue set beyond just security and deterrence of China. And I think in a lot of ways, the US is falling down on the job.
About the Indo-Pacific, we always talk about Taiwan through the China lens or through the US-China great power rivalry. we hardly talk about how Taiwan views itself in the Indo-Pacific. So when we talk about Taiwan's Indo-Pacific policy, its policy is linked to China's aggression. Taiwan has become more and more active within the Indo-Pacific region, primarily after China became much more aggressive with respect to Taiwan. And uh, if there has to be a conflict in the Indo-Pacific region, we know it has to be a Taiwan contingency. But if it actually happens, we know that the entire stability of the Indo-Pacific will be impacted, and like-minded countries are going to be impacted. And Taiwan does hold economic, strategic, and normative value for a lot of like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific, including Washington, Quad countries, and even European countries now. We see a lot of parliamentary delegation visits from Europe to Taiwan, even from Australia. So Taiwan is definitely becoming more and more important for countries in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think this is one of the reasons why when Pelosi's visit happened, scholars around the world were quick enough to label the tensions, the live fire drill as a fourth straight crisis. I was in Taiwan. I didn't feel it was a fourth straight crisis by any parameter. But I think, and in fact, when you talk to Taiwanese people, they don't say that the invasion is imminent. It's not imminent. We know about that. And I'm not saying it because I feel, or is it a thing that Taiwanese are oblivion to the China threat? It's just that they have been living under the China threat that has been normalized. But it also tells us that they know that Chinese are not going to invade Taiwan. There are different reasons for that. Perhaps I can talk about it later. But it's very important to understand what Taiwan thinks of itself within the broader cross-strait conflict. There are within Taiwan as well, there are several perspectives. The first is how people view themselves and how people view the cross-strait tension. What they want is status quo. They don't want a conflict. But when I talk about the ruling party, that is Democratic Progressive Party, what they want, there are different factions within the party. One faction wants the status quo and another faction wants independence. But the president, Tsai Ing-wen, she is more focused on maintaining the status quo. But now the major opposition party in Taiwan, that is Kuomintang, that's considered nationalist party, that's more focused on political reconciliation with China. And they were the architect of the 1992 consensus. So the 1992 consensus was, it entails that there are two Chinas across the Taiwan Strait, but there is no consensus about what exactly China is. So now, if I talk about the government policies, the current government policies with respect to what is happening right now with China, they have mentioned several times that unprovoked heightened military threat looms large over Taiwan. Taiwan is not going to provoke China, but they're not going to back down. This is something that's very different from the previous government. Then there is also this realization, and there is also this message that they want to convey to the world that engagement with other countries, parliamentary delegation, isn't really a provocation. And this is one of the reasons why Taiwan wants to take advantage of its popularity within the Indo-Pacific construct. And this is why they want to engage with more and more like-minded countries in the Indo-Pacific region. But when it comes to cross-strait relations, what they prefer, what they want is to have a dialogue with China. China suspended the dialogue in 2016 when Taiwan refused to accept the 1992 consensus. Then till 2019, China was kind of content with poaching Taiwan's diplomatic allies, but since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan began to gain a lot of popularity. China got a lot of support at the international level. That was something that really made China concerned about what is going to happen in the Taiwan Strait, in cross-strait relationship. But since then, since this popularity of Taiwan and since so much support for Taiwan, what the focus of the government has been is on the self-determination to the Taiwanese people. That means that the fate of Taiwan should be decided by the people of Taiwan. Then if we talk about the external engagement within the Indo-Pacific region, US is the most important partner for Taiwan. Taiwan is dependent on US for its partnership for a number of reasons, but as I already mentioned about the criticism that Taiwan has been facing about not spending enough on its defense capabilities. That's also changing. And in fact, today only there was this act that was uh, out from the US side. And US, there's a condition that US is only going to spend a certain amount of money if Taiwan also spends on its defense capabilities. So there is this kind of mutual help and assistance that's coming, that's between US and Taiwan. Then in 2016, Taiwan came up with this policy called New Southbound Policy. So that's primarily to diversify its external engagement and to reduce reliance on a single market, that's China. Uh, so what Taiwan has been asking for, from the Indo-Pacific countries is that respect one China policy. Taiwan isn't really asking for diplomatic recognition from countries. What it is really asking for is to have parallel ties with both Taiwan and China. But what is more concerning for the countries of the Indo-Pacific is that Taiwan talks about Indo-Pacific. Every now and then we see there are a lot of statements that are coming out of Taiwan. Every other conference is on the Indo-Pacific in Taiwan. But unlike other countries, Taiwan hasn't really come up with its own Indo-Pacific strategy or vision. Understandably, if Taiwan comes up with an Indo-Pacific strategy, it's going to be considered as an act of war by China. But there is this threat that looms large. If Taiwan really wants to become a true part of the Indo-Pacific, it has to come up with its own strategy.
Thank you, Sana. That was I'm sure Evan would have thoughts on it and the conversations on it, but I do want to move to turn to Yuki once before we come back to the second round of questions and conversations. And I think picking up from what you said in terms of looking at Indo-Pacific as an advantage or a strategic opportunity by a lot of countries. Indo-Pacific in Japan is big. Japan is really has a strong vision and outlook towards the Indo-Pacific, Yuki, and but the Indo-Pacific is also vast geographically. Different countries have different priorities, different sub-regions that are of importance to them. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the audience here and online on Japan's concerns and priorities in the Indo-Pacific, what it seeks to do through this concept of bringing together the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. And if you see, if there are areas where Japan perhaps diverges from Washington's approach or view to the region in a way that might not be helpful for Tokyo.
Gladly. Thank you, Darshana. It's great to see you, even though it's virtually. I wish I could have been there in person. But thank you again for the Carnegie Middle East Center for this kind invitation. Already I'm learning a lot from the past two speakers, so I would like to just add a few of my thoughts. So in response to your question, Darshana, like you mentioned in the outset, this confluence of two seas, which really late former Prime Minister Abe put out during his visit to India, which I think itself is symbolic in terms of his own strategic thinking about the just basically his landscaping, the Indian Ocean area and a Pacific Ocean area as one big strategic region. I think is really coming to take roots in the Japanese policymakers' thinking, and that is definitely largely driven by the expanding Chinese influence, particularly Chinese assertiveness on a certain front. Economic coercion is one, aggressive behavior in the territorial claims area, such as South China Sea, and East China Sea is the other. But really, the just a concern that this once everyone's hoping that the China will be a quote unquote responsible stakeholder, and that possibility is getting smaller and smaller. And I really don't think anyone is really talking about that possibility now. Is really getting Japan to focus what it can do to contribute and actively participate in preserving the liberal international order in this vast strategic region, which is very important for Japan's own national security as well. Because Japan is an island nation, it does depends a lot on the external imports and exports out of Japan. Many of that, really vast majority of that, passes through somewhere in the Indo-Pacific region. And it does have a very important diplomatic partners in the region. We have been spending a lot of time talking about India, but from Japan's perspective, going down to the South Pacific, Australia is another very important partner for Japan in this endeavor. And just as, and then I think that is because that is the main reason why when the Obama administration came up with the concept of a Trans-Pacific Partnership, there were a lot about in that Trans-Pacific Partnership that it was very difficult for Japan to change domestically to allow Japan's active participation. But late Prime Minister Abe made a strategic decision that Japan really needs to be at the center of the driving force of this concept. And it was just very unfortunate that once the Obama administration ended, U.S. actually did withdraw from that TPP that Mr. Abe put so much of his own political capital to push forward. But I think the fact that Japan stuck to that basic TPP concept and ending up holding it together in the manner of a CPTPP, and also became the central force in concluding RCEP agreement. I think it really talks about it really is a telltale sign that Japan really looks at this region not just important militarily, but then also even more so in the trade and economic space. So, what is Japan's concerns when we look at this region? Just like Japan itself, Japan is not alone. Vast majority of the countries in this region also consider the China as a very important trading partner. But at the same time, all of us are grappling with the fact that what do we do with a country that is an important trading partner, but it also presents significant and very serious national security challenges in the region. And in that space, Evan, I hope I get to get your take on it. But the current recently announced U.S. national security strategy, where the Biden administration casted the world as the almost bipolar structure of a democracy versus autocracy, that that puts a lot of challenge in many countries in this Indo-Pacific region, because almost any country in the region really do not necessarily want to clearly take sides. But then the way that Biden administration currently casts the world, I think a lot of countries in the region are increasingly feeling the pressure of pick a side. And I think Japan really kind of comes into the crucial connecting node here, where appreciating those concerns probably expressed by many countries in the region, and sharing that some of that, but still can articulate why it is important for these countries to stick to the side and uphold the values and norms that were flourishing and that can only flourish in the current liberal international order. And Japan's own effort in this is they have already put a significant investment in shoring up its own relationship with Southeast Asia, of course, India, Australia, South Pacific Island, but then also Japan for the first time really seriously looking at enhancing its own defense capability. Just recently, Prime Minister Kishida announced that his government will shoot to increase Japan's defense budget to 2% of GDP, basically a NATO standard, in the next 5 years, which was a much faster pace than actually, frankly, some of us had expected. And that really shows the seriousness in which current Japanese government is taking up this challenge. So I'll just stop here, and then I'll look forward to further comments from my co-panelists and a question from the audience.
Thank you, Yuki. Evan, coming back to you in terms of, I think what you said in your opening remarks about both China and US being narcissistic in a way that they make everything about themselves and they find themselves in the middle of, all of the conversations. So I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate on that a little bit in terms of how do you see that playing out, given if both US and China is making everything about themselves, but you also said in your kind of opening remarks that there's a whole world outside of it, and that's essentially what Yuki and Sana are saying as well, that there are issues and there are conversations that does not necessarily align with either of them. So how do you see this playing out, and what kind of possible consequences there could be in terms of geopolitical conversations and competition in this. And if there's any part of Sana's comments on Taiwan and how Taiwan looks at the world, because that conversation is very different in Washington. I think you say that in Washington, almost threat is imminent as far as Washington goes. So I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate on some of those, Evan.
Okay. Well, let me start with the headline, and I'm going to turn my volume down again because I'm getting the feedback. There is the region that actually exists. And then to be blunt about it, there is the region of American wishes, dreams, and fantasies. And the latter is a region in which, as I said in my opening, the United States is the central player in both the security and economic realms, and a region in which the United States-China competition refracts and frames virtually every issue in the region. And I want to focus on something that Yuki said, because the reality is the region is in fact multifaceted. And as your question implies, it's increasingly multipolar on issues and functions that actually matter to people and governments and firms. And my example of who's setting the trade standards before gets at that directly, because if the United States is on the outside of the standard setting agreements with its nose pressed against the glass looking in, then we can hardly by logical intuition say that the United States is the central player, much less that it's all about the United States and China. So the United States, I think in that context, has what I would characterize as four basic problems. And I'm talking off the top of my head, listening to your question, but I think these capture it. The first goes to Yuki's point about choosing a side. She's exactly right. Countries in the region don't want to pick a side. And why should they? They have to live there. They got to live next door to China. China's not going anywhere. And if you try to choose a side, you have to fight the map. And as Yuki said, you have to fight economic gravity. But the reality is on a daily basis, almost every day and in every way, both the United States and China are trying to compel countries to choose a side. It's really embedded in American rhetoric. You listen to speeches by the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, or others, and they'll say, we don't want countries to choose a side. Okay, fine. Try putting, kit from Huawei, the Chinese company, in your 5G backbone telecom infrastructure and see whether the United States still wants to collaborate with you on all sorts of technology-based packages and solutions. It will not. So de facto, it is asking you to choose a side. The United States has a very robust set of export controls, everything from the so-called foreign direct product rule to the Commerce Department entity list that restrict how American origin technology, but also knowledge, can flow to China. Try blowing through American export controls and see whether the United States wants you to choose a side. Absolutely, the United States is compelling choices every day in all sorts of ways. And China has a mirror image analog of that, because the government in China has spent years developing a mirror image list of export controls and coercive instruments that are designed to compel compliance from its partners. The US has, for example, an entity list. China has something now called an unreliable entities list. They're mirror images. So for companies especially, it's creating dual compliance problems, but it gets at why other countries don't want to get caught betwixt and between. So that then comes to the second problem, which is there is this question, which is what your question is getting at, of who writes the rules. The US talks about a rules-based order in Asia as if there are only American rules or Chinese rules to choose from. And if you don't believe me on that, let's rewind the clock to an interview that President Obama gave to a Wall Street Journal reporter back in 2016 when he was trying to make the case, as Yuki said, for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He was asked by the reporter, why should the US be in the TPP? And he responded, because if we don't write the rules, China's going to write the rules out in that region. So there you go. Very bipolar framing. There are only three possibilities. And I'm oversimplifying because President Obama did this partly for domestic political effect. But if you think about what he's saying the future of the region is either going to be American-centric or it's going to be China-centric. We write the rules or they write the rules. Or alternatively, it will be bipolar like the Cold War, which, as I said earlier, had very perverse outcomes. And everybody picks a side and we get two blocks that are fairly rigid. That is not in the interest of the countries in the region for the reason that I said earlier, economic gravity and the map. But it also is why they are increasingly stepping into the breach themselves. So that brings us to the third problem, It's not just that the United States is on the outside of these kind of standard setting agreements looking in and needs to rediscover its role as a standard setting nation. It's that on issues and functions that are outside the scope of those agreements, things like digital trade, which the United States has made a central plank of its effort in the so-called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to promote non-China centric rules. The reality is American partners don't agree on the rules that they want to write. And so we're heading for a period potentially of fragmentation among the democracies. Take something like data governance. And we've done a couple of reports on this at Carney, on the Korean way with data, the Indian way with data, on things like cross-border data access and transfers or data localization. And you have some of this in the Middle East, whether the data is stored locally or you put it in the cloud and you store it in servers offshore. Just take India. Indian law enforcement absolutely does not want the data of Indian citizens stored offshore. So this has become basically a recipe for fragmentation among the democracies. So not only will you not get a US-centric thing, but this rhetoric in the national security strategy about a democratic way or an autocratic way begins to fall flat when you hit the real world of rule writing and standard setting. And that brings me to the fourth and final point, which is the United States likes to say it's all about writing the rules. But the United States, as I said earlier, increasingly is not the one writing the rules. And it conflates rule writing with what I would call doing business. If you think about Southeast Asia, in the 10 ASEAN countries, the countries of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations alone, the United States has about $230 billion of direct investment, which dwarfs China's share. It dwarfs China's share. So the United States, for all the talk about China, is still a huge player and a much larger player in the investment front, although less so on the trade side in relative terms. But the problem is that's business, and American companies can do business under anybody's rules. American companies have been doing business in China for years under Chinese rules. As we've learned recently, since February and the invasion of Ukraine, German companies were doing business in Russia under Russian rules. So if you don't write the rules, then your companies will adapt to other people's rules. And so what I see happening, as I said earlier, to circle back to where I started, is the US has forgotten its role as a standard setting nation. And if you pull the thread on where the region is heading over the next 10 or 15 years, all these other players that don't want to get caught betwixt and between are going to write rules, set standards, develop norms, and deal with one another themselves. That is happening in the trade space. It's increasingly happening in the data space. It's going to happen in the public health space because one thing we've learned from the pandemic is it entrenched US-China competition. There's a lot of finger pointing. They don't recognize each other's vaccines. There's argument about who started the pandemic. Did it leak from a lab and why? So if you're another Asian country, especially one that is large, economically powerful, military capable, like Japan, like India, like South Korea, and you're self-interested, you look in this and you say, why do I want the US and China to be the spoilers of collective action? And so what I see happening is a whole variety of players stepping into the breach, bargaining among themselves and trying to backfoot the United States and China and get them to play by the region's rules. And the question now will be whether the United States, because I'm American and I'm sitting in Washington, is going to be sufficiently adaptive to that. And the jury may be out, but the US is running out of time. And I think Yuki will agree with me on this. I mean, if the US doesn't begin to change its posture and stop just talking about security and China, it's going to find itself on the outside looking in. And the reason for that is if you tell countries in the region that you only care about them as proxies in your own strategic competition with China, that is, pardon my language, a piss poor message to the region, because it means you don't really care about them on their own terms. And that's why the region is changing. And I just, the US has gotten lucky that China has been so clumsy diplomatically and in a variety of other ways. But if China were more supple, the US would be in a lot of trouble strategically right now. I'll leave the Taiwan thing aside.
Thanks, Evan. So now coming to kind of the other part of the Indo-Pacific in terms of India, Yuki mentioned about Japan and India, and a lot of Indo-Pacific strategies and vision does place India at the at least as a key partner, if not a prominent partner in it. But India has a lot of relationships which don't sit comfortably with the US and its partners. Take the region we're sitting in. India has a different relationship with Iran, a lot of the Gulf countries, in a way that does not coincide with the US. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit on India's Indo-Pacific strategy, India's Indo-Pacific vision, and of course, India-Taiwan, since that's something you work on as well.
I think when we talk about India's Indo-Pacific policy, it differs from how US views the Indo-Pacific. And I think the unique part about the Indo-Pacific is that every country have different rules. Ivan already talked about it, and US centrality doesn't really matter to a lot of countries when it comes to the Indo-Pacific. And I think for India, India is trying to find its own role within the region. And India is trying to play a bigger role. India was the first country to talk about ASEAN centrality within the Indo-Pacific region, and then other countries followed. So what India has been trying to do is to find its own place, navigate its own interest, and what its policy has been is to focus on issue-based coalition. When India became a part of the revived quadrilateral dialogue, and India is one of the pioneer countries in the Indo-Pacific, the purpose for India was to deal with the China challenge. China threat was at the core of the Quad, and to some extent at the Indo-Pacific, for the Indo-Pacific as well. So when countries such as US, Japan, Australia, I won't really include Japan in that because I feel that Japan is one of the most understanding countries when it comes to India's interest. But mostly the Western countries, they have very unrealistic expectations from India. Russia isn't a part of India's Indo-Pacific strategy, vision I would call it. India has been a part of the Quad only and only because of its issues with China. What India has been trying to do is to find a collective approach for China threat. So then expecting that India become a part of dealing with the Russia threat or dealing with Iran is not going to happen. India has different relationship, different interests with countries such as Russia, Iran. India is not going to leave those relationships just because US and other countries want India to do it. It's not going to happen. And I think there's this realization that's also kind of creeping in within the strategic community in Washington and other countries as well. But what I've realized that other Indo-Pacific stakeholders are much more accommodative towards India. I live in Taiwan. In the past 1 year, less than 1 year, no one has come to me and asked me a question about India's approach vis-a-vis Russia-Ukraine war. But if I'm participating in a webinar, this is something that I have to answer to. But so I believe that Asian countries are much more accommodative towards India's interest, India's approach towards Russia-Ukraine war. So your next question was about India-Taiwan relations. India's policy towards Taiwan is definitely changing. I'm seeing more positive development, positive changes with respect to India-Taiwan relationship. Of course, India is still cautious. No matter what, India still adheres to the One China policy, even though since 2010, India hasn't really talked about One China policy. In 2014, then Foreign Minister of India told Wang Yi that if China wants India to respect One China policy, it also has to respect One India policy. So, of course, on papers, we don't see One China policy, but still there. But there is another interesting point about India's adherence to One China policy. India has never talked about Taiwan while mentioning One China policy. So there was always this room about the status of Taiwan with respect to India and India's position. But if I may also talk about India's position in a potential Taiwan contingency, I don't think India would like to play any direct role in a Taiwan contingency, not in the next 5 to 10 years. And in a lot of literature, specifically from the Western countries, I've been seeing that there's a scenario that's been recommended that if China invades Taiwan, India should help assist US by keeping China occupied at the LAC. It's not going to happen. India has its own problem with China. And direct involvement in a military conflict that doesn't really concern India is not a traditional policy of India. Of course, with Taiwan, we definitely saw a change, but it doesn't mean that India is going ahead with the military role in the conflict. Then apart from that, no matter what, despite the positive developments in the relationship, India-Taiwan relations are not deep enough yet. The stakes aren't really high for India to take such a step, be it economic relationship, be it cultural relationship, and these are the components that are within the mandate of the relationship. But despite that, the trade remains below 10 billion mark. Look at people-to-people relationship. There are just 5,000 Indians, and we are 1.2 billion people. 5,000 Indians in a country, it just doesn't matter. Then India has its own problem with China. It's just not going to go ahead with that. And then even if we talk about India's position within the Indo-Pacific region and India's growing security relationship ties with the US, for Taiwan, there is no arrangement with the US yet. And it hasn't, and even if we talk about the US support for India, India hasn't really got the kind of support that the West expects India to give in a Taiwan contingency, for example, with India's issues with Pakistan or in 1971. But Soviet Union had done that. And I think this is one of the reasons why India is kind of hesitant in this neutral position of India's nuclear position in Russia-Ukraine war that we are witnessing right now. So I feel that with US, of course, we are seeing that the relationship is moving in the right direction. We see that this partnership is very robust in the Indo-Pacific, but there is still some trust deficit that the two countries need to bridge and need to work towards. So yeah, I don't really see that India is going to play an important role in the Taiwan contingency.
Thank you. Yuki, coming to you on something, I want to pick up something that you mentioned in your opening remarks on the bipolar way of setting the world in terms of democracy versus autocracy. And I think it's a conversation, and there has definitely been references to it in the conversations of the last day and a half. And what he said, and again, what I think has Evans also said, in terms of choosing sides, Japan is in this unique position where it's in the region, it doesn't want to have such a binary focus on it, doesn't want to perhaps find itself choosing sides, but also is a key partner to the United States, and where U.S. presence in the area is very important to Japanese security. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit in terms of how Japan is navigating this, because it's something that is presented to Southeast Asian nations quite often, and a lot of other countries around the region for whom China is a very big economic partner, and it plays out in the China-India competition in the Indian Ocean as well, where countries find that in this position. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit on how Japan's navigating that.
That is a very good question, Darshana. I think Japan is still in the middle of trying to figure it out, but I think, and I don't think there is really there will never be like a perfect balance, if you will, that Japan can strike. But I think Japan is kind of taking a two-pronged, couple of approaches on this. So in the trade and economic space, it tries to stay in the game, right? I mean, it did stay in the TPP after US withdrew, and put together with the other countries that were also have already signed up on TPP, and kind of saved it, if you will, as a CPTPP, and then also really did lead the effort on the other regional economic framework like RCEP. So that is one way that it's trying to navigate, which is by staying in those games and keep the connectivity to the countries in the region. It really does send a message that we do care about what happens in this region. We, like you, live in this region. And this is the forever debate that goes on with, when we talk about how U.S. and Japan respectively approaches China. Japan lives, next door to China, even if there is a body of water. But unless there's some climate change pushes it away from the continent, China will always be Japan's large neighbor in every sense of the word, population-wise, landmass-wise. So it does have to manage its relationship with China, but do so as it also tries to stay as a key security partner of the United States. So I think Japan tries to do that by, on a trade economic space, like I said, try to stay in the game, and sometimes leading some of those regional efforts within the region. Japan also often emphasizes the ASEAN centrality when it comes to Southeast Asia, how it continues to respect ASEAN centrality on all things happening in ASEAN, even though continue to push the envelope on that, basically, and try to articulate that those sometimes those values are important. Sometimes those universal norms are important. And that's what Prime Minister Kishida was doing when he was visiting Southeast Asia earlier in the year. It was not too soon. It was not too long after the Russian-Ukraine conflict started. A lot of the countries in the Asia have not really voiced the clear support for Ukraine. That's when Prime Minister Kishida stepped in and said, "Look, what Ukraine is going through can happen to you, and how you behave here in the eyes of the world does come to matter when something similar to this happens to you, and you come under this intense pressure from the big neighbor, trading partner, whatever you call it, that you're having problem with." Um, so I guess I'm encouraging the regional countries to try to internalize this issue on their own terms. I think it's really the way that Japan is trying to navigate itself into this. And it does emphasize certain elements that resonates with the U.S. policy, like, respect for universal norms, universal code of conduct, rule of law. Those are the fundamental values that Japan does also uphold and try to uphold. But in their own, in its own terms. And I think that's what Japan has been encouraging other countries to do. But then at the same time, though, on the security realm, it does invest in building up capacities of the militaries and coast guards in the region. It does have a long-standing capacity building relationship with Southeast Asia. It has vamped up its security partnership both with India and Australia. And with Australia, it really is looking very much like an alliance in the absence of a formal bilateral mutual security treaty. They have all the institutional framework in place to solidify and institutionalize that security partnership. And I think Japan's relationship with India is really heading toward that route as well. And those relations are in close kind of consultation with the United States, but also happening on the somewhat independent pace between Japan and those countries. So I think Japan continues to anchor its relationship in the alliance with the United States, but at the same time, it does have its own initiatives. And I think it'll be interesting, actually. No one has talked about the South Korea. South Korea can be an important player in this map too. But South Korea, like Japan, lives right next door to China. So, and then in a sense, it's on the continent. So it is living under much more intense pressure coming from China. So how to weave South Korea also into this conversation? U.S. has a key role in it. And Japan, hopefully, with the new administration now in Seoul, try to solidify its domestic position, will be able to resume more constructive relationship with the Seoul. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm conscious of the time, and I have one question for Evan. But before I do, just wanted to remind our audience online, if you have any questions, please do type them out, and I think our team will collate them. And for those in the room as well, I'll come back to you just in a minute. Evan, I wanted to just turn to you for one last question. In terms of, we talk a lot about how U.S. is viewing the world and the priorities and challenges, and of course where China fits into it. But you understand and you know China pretty well as well. And I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit with the audience in terms of how China is viewing this competition or the priorities in the region. What are China's concerns, whether it's domestic or international? What are the priorities? Because often outside of the U.S. perspective and outside of the U.S. lens, and I believe it stands true for the region as well, with engagements with China, it's not necessarily the bad partner or a bad player in there. So I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit from Chinese perspective, from China's point of view, looking out into the world.
Sure. Well, I'm not a Chinese communist, but if I was one, I'll try and flip into their shoes for a second and tell you how I would see the world. I think the first thing to say, and you teased this in your question, is that if you were the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, currently Mr. Xi Jinping, the first 5 things you think about when you get out of bed in the morning, whether you get out of bed on the left side or on the right side, are all domestic in China. The first is essentially how to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power, preferably indefinitely. Second, how to create around 11 to 12 million new jobs a year, because there is enormous pressure on the labor market from both ends of the spectrum, from migrant labor at one end and white collar college graduates at the other end. And both of those constituencies can be very politically volatile when the employment market contracts and there aren't jobs available, which ties back the second priority to the first one. Third, how do you grow the economy at a requisite percentage? Not necessarily, the 8-9% that we saw in years past, but to not fall off the cliff so that you can create the kind of employment that you need, particularly for urban Chinese, where service businesses, things like package delivery or restaurants, these are the disproportionate sources of employment for a lot of urban Chinese. Fourth, China has a demographic problem. Essentially, it's getting old before it gets rich. And without debating all these questions around middle income and middle income traps, the point is China has because of a one-child policy that prevailed for decades, China has a lot of older people in a pension system that in some ways is broken. They've reformed urban enterprise pensions, but the rest of the pension system is not completely remade. And what's more, one of the reasons they've had this zero dynamic COVID policy for so long, I believe, is that they have a lot of elderly people and they genuinely don't believe that the national public health system can handle the stress at scale. And then finally, they've had a growth model that is, to be blunt about it, energy intensive, but energy inefficient and extremely environmentally unfriendly. So when you add all that up, you have a lot on their plate domestically that they need to deal with. In 2007, long before Mr. Xi took power, the then Prime Minister of China, whose name was Wen Jiabao, famously gave a press conference in which he referred to the Chinese economy as unbalanced, uncoordinated, unstable, and unsustainable. So that was in 2007. I mean, that's 15 years ago. And they're very good, if I could use a medical metaphor, diagnosticians. They understand the problems very well, but prescriptively, a lot of these choices are extremely fraught and they involve very difficult trade-offs. When China joined the World Trade Organization, they laid off 30 or 40 million people out of state-owned enterprises to discipline the economy. There's no such external lever today, and there's no such political stomach today. And particularly at a time when this leadership in China under Mr. Xi is particularly paranoid and particularly insecure. I mean, at the most recent Chinese Communist Party Congress, they referred to insecurity, I lost count of how many times. That's essentially the environment that we're dealing with. And meanwhile, growth is not off the cliff, but it's slowing considerably. And so the core question, these are the core questions for them. And there's the question of how to get essentially slower, but higher quality growth that puts you into a slower growth, higher inflation, but more sustainable world. Now that brings us to the foreign policy piece, because if you're that insecure and if you're dealing with that set of challenges, both in scope, intensity, and complexity, obviously you view your external environment with a lot of fear and suspicion. And we've talked a lot about Chinese coercion, Chinese nationalism, China threatening all of its neighbors. All of that is true. And in fact, one of the reasons I said earlier that the United States is in no danger of losing the centrality of its security role is precisely because everybody's scared of China in this part of the world. They worry about Chinese coercion. A lot of them, I had the Australian Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, here at Carnegie yesterday in Washington for a speech. I mean, Australia's been on the blunt end of a lot of Chinese threats, coercion. China's actually presented demands to Australia, gotten nowhere with that. Any country in the region is afraid of China. So they got to live there, as I said, but they're afraid. But if you flip it and you try to walk in Chinese shoes for a second, I think the combination of this domestic insecurity, external insecurity as the United States and its partners organize from China's perspective, posse, like in a John Wayne movie, of countries that are going to constrict China's space, new uses of US export controls that are designed to constrict the flow of capital, technology, data, and knowledge, and even skilled people to China. China feels, somewhat beset. I don't really want to litigate that because you asked me to walk in their shoes for a second. That's how they see the world. And in that context, I think that's why I called them narcissists, because they refract a lot through the prism of what I would describe as a highly confrontational relationship with the United States in particular, that increasingly has large doses of adversarial antagonism to it. And so that's what they're trying to get out from under. I think the big question that a lot of people like me find difficult to answer, therefore, is why their diplomacy hasn't been more supple, because it wouldn't take a lot to make nice to countries around the world in ways that could backfoot the United States, but they've done quite the contrary. So the Chinese like to point the finger at the United States and say, it's all because of you. You're out to get us. You're containing Chinese power. You're organizing all these countries. But the reality, as my co-panelists will confirm, and you, Darshana, yourself will confirm, is that China's relations over the last several years with countries around the world have deteriorated significantly. It's not just the United States. They've deteriorated with nearly every country in Europe, with Japan, with India, with almost every OECD economy. So there's clearly something that's remarkably unself-reflective in the way the Chinese look at all this. And Mr. Xi is different than the previous leaders. He's got a harder edge. He's a communist, he's a statist, he's very much a hyper-nationalist, and he views his goal as what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which he aims to complete, potentially in a metaphorical, but potentially also in a literal sense, by the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China in 2049. And so that being the case, I think what people like me and Sana and Yuki and you think we're seeing is a much more assertive China, one that's not necessarily very self-reflective about its own actions and choices that may have produced this deterioration in relations, and one that finds that actually coercion can be pretty effective. I mean, we talk a lot about soft power. China's not looking to win any popularity contests. I mean, what they're trying to leverage is the map, as I said, and economic gravity, and they've got a lot to work with. So if you look at polling from the Pew organization and others, China's become very unpopular around the world. But the question is, does that mean they think they're doing badly? I'm not so sure. I don't see a lot of countries, particularly smaller countries, challenging them directly. And what's more, there's a big bifurcation in their relationships with the United States and OECD economies on the one hand, and what I would call the global South on the other. You're all sitting in the Middle East, and it's the last thing I'd say. China remarkably has pulled off this trick of having good relations with all of the major power centers in the Middle East. They have good relationships with Tehran, with Riyadh, with Israel, with Turkey. Could the United States have that? Not with Iran, certainly. Can Europeans have that? Not necessarily. So China, because their offering is multifaceted and robust, and because a lot of it has economics and training and upskilling in the lead, I think in a way that the United States doesn't, in the global South, their agenda and their offering speaks, as I said, to the aspirations of a lot of countries. Their agenda is not about getting caught in US-China competition. It's about growth, employment, upskilling, sustainability, innovation. And so it's not surprising, therefore, that in, for instance, Saudi Arabia, where China is the contractor on some of the vision projects, natural language processing, the cloud, Alibaba, they're all doing it. Or in other countries, China is seen as having an offering that marries skilling to digital build out to construction. And, the United States could probably learn something from that because, and this is the last thing I'd say, as I said earlier, if you treat countries just as proxies in your own competition, it is a very poor message indeed. Because for most places in the world, the name of the game is addition and multiplication. It's not subtraction and division. And China, like the United States, and as your question implies, has made the mistake of, I think, trying to offshore some elements of its model. It scares people, but they still find it possible to extract from China things that China's been willing to deliver. I hope that answers your question.
Summary of some of the complexities that we face in the region vis-a-vis the China question, I think. Questions in the room, if there are questions in the room, somebody with a mic will find you right there. And
Hi,
yes.
I'm still Olivia, still from Carnegie Europe. Sana, I have a question for you. Yukon yesterday talked about Taipei, particularly with the lens of the semiconductor economy, both for security reasons, but also for the sustainability of the global economy, essentially. Earlier this summer, there was a drought alert that threatened, at least for some weeks, the manufacturing of those semiconductors. So I'm guessing my question is, how is climate change viewed in Taipei, and what are the steps that are being taken in order to protect the economy from climate disruptions? And then the second question has nothing to do with the first, and is a sort of regional bias, but how does Taipei see the European Union and it's sort of like the line, confusing line that it's trying to toe with China? Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, for bringing in both climate and Europe into the conversation. Indo-Pacific is big. Maybe one more question before we go back to the panel. Yeah, please.
Hello, it's Farhat Tutkal from LAU. I would like to shift the focus of the debate from state level to individual level, if I may, social level. So currently there are democratic movements we know in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Myanmar, Thailand, but I wonder if there is a cross-national democratic pro-democracy movement and demand for democracy, or are they just simply pro-sovereignty and anti-China's expansionist demands? Because when we talk about the binary view between choosing sides between democracy or authoritarianism, it should be a correspondence on the region. So are there really democratic movements, or are they just pro-sovereignty movements? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we go back to the panel on this. Sana, the question to you on climate and EU from Olivia, and to Evan and Yuki, either if you wanted to take the question on the question on pro-democracy movement, the binary question in the region. Sana, maybe we can start with you.
Thank you, Olivia. Both the questions are very good. And, when we talk about climate change, we really don't talk about what Taiwan is doing, because Taiwan is not really a part of the international system of collective effort to deal with the climate change. But you rightly mentioned about the drought alert last year. But I think that was temporary. Taiwan received so much rainfall that since then we have just been talking about how that has not been an issue in Taiwan. But climate change is a real issue, and Taiwan is definitely taking a lot of steps. I am not an expert on what Taiwan is doing with respect to climate change, but one of the things that Taiwan has been doing is carbon emission 2050. So 2050 is the deadline for that. But apart from that, I don't really see in conferences, in the strategic community, the discussion on climate change isn't happening. It's happening at the government level. So yeah, I won't be the right person to give you the proper answer about that. But Taiwan is very friendly towards EU, because EU is also kind of reaching out to Taiwan. There are a lot of parliamentary delegation visits that have happened specifically in the past 2 years. When we talk about EU and Europe, we generally talk about Central and Eastern European countries. And the first country that we talk about is Lithuania, and how Lithuania, the discussion is primarily about how Lithuania stood up to China threat. And I think Lithuania is one of the, I think, is the only country that allowed Taiwan to use the name Taiwan in the representative office. And it's the reason is, of course, economic as well. Look at how much investment Taiwan is giving to Lithuania now. And Taiwanese are crazy when it comes to buying products. Look at Freedom Wine, when 200% tariff was imposed on Australian wine. Australian wine became so famous in Taiwan, and then Lithuanian products, specifically chocolate, is a hit in Taiwan. So this is what happens when a country stands up to China. So Central and Eastern European countries are something that Taiwan is very favorable and friendly towards. And of course, with this Ukraine crisis, Taiwan is one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine from the region. Every now and then we keep seeing news how much Taiwan is giving in donation, in aid to Ukraine. And there are free scholarships, free visas for Ukrainian now to come to Taiwan. So, of course, Germany and France are somewhat considered black sheep, but when we talk about parliamentary delegation visit, we just got a visit from Germany as well, just 2 or 3 weeks. So there is a lot of cooperation, at least at the level of parliamentarians. But government level, Taiwan doesn't really expect a lot from the government, but at least Europe is one region where we see ministerial visits, specifically from the Central and Eastern European countries. So there's a lot of cooperation. EU office in Taiwan is very proactive. They talk about Taiwan's inclusion in the international system in the Indo-Pacific. So I would say that Taiwan-Europe relation is one set of relationship that is gaining a lot of prominence, and there's a lot of potential and promise from this set of relationship.
On the question on, I think, on pro-democracy or the binaries, right? Using the examples of Hong Kong and Myanmar, I don't know if Evan or Yuki wanted to take a stab at it, but I think, to paraphrase, is it really pro-democracy movement across the region with Hong Kong, or is it just sort of anti-China protest, right?
Well,
Evan? Yep.
yeah, I mean, first, can I just say something about the Taiwan climate question, because it's something I've worked on, actually. I think Taiwan's got the same basic problem that a lot of economies have, and Taiwan is a major economy, which is to transition in its energy thinking from the old emphasis on energy security in a context where the number of oil fields around the world has supposedly shrunk, to basically thinking about security in terms of decarbonization and leveraging technology. And the fact is that requires a paradigm shift that Taiwan has been not sufficiently successful at making. The government has very ambitious targets for a renewable build out, but it has missed nearly all of them. And what's more, nuclear power is not part of the mix because the ruling party in Taiwan, the Democratic Progressive Party, has made one of its signatures to be opposed to nuclear power. So they have big ambitions, but they're falling short. And their challenge, I think, begins at home. It's not really with global climate negotiations. If you're interested in this question, I actually wrote a report on this with a colleague in Taiwan. So it's called Overcoming Taiwan's Energy Trilemma. It's a Carnegie report, the trilemma being security, affordability, and sustainability. And we had an event on Taiwan and climate change that you can watch digitally online, where I had some of the best experts in Taiwan on climate and new energy. So I highly recommend that to you. On the democracy question, I think one thing that would be interesting for Yuki to talk about just quickly is Japan's role in promoting, because I've never thought of Japanese foreign policy as essentially putting democracy at the center. It's not the organizing principle of Japanese foreign policy, but recently Japan has put some emphasis on it. And all I would say is most of the movements that you referred to in places like Myanmar, these are indigenous movements that are directed mainly at political conditions within their own country. That is their origin. A lot of them have a long history. The democracy movement in Burma, in Myanmar, for example, has a long history of struggling against military dominance. And there have been successive cycles of military dominance because the military and the role of the military in politics has been so deeply embedded in the fabric of the country since the very beginning. The Burmese military, the Tatmadaw, which is what it's called in Burmese, has been really a central institutional actor in the political system. And so as Burma has become more open, and particularly over the last decade, obviously that movement has changed shape in response to a military coup. So I view it as largely indigenous in nature, but there is greater coordination among civil society, among civic activists and democracy movements. I'm American, so I'm ideologically committed to all this. And I think actually that even though I don't tend to refract my strategic frame into a world of democracies and autocracies, I think the world would be a better place if the world were populated mainly by democracies. And so that kind of civic coordination among movements, among activists, and this includes not just democracy movements, but women's rights activists, civil society groups, people struggling against domestic violence around the world. These things all build a civic consciousness in ways that I think open space across borders in Asia, even when it's not just about challenging governments in a political sense. But Yuki might want to say something about the strategic element of that.
Order brief response on democracy.
Yeah, I think let me just keep it very brief. I'm very conscious of time as well. Evan's right. Japan's engagement. Well, I mean, Japan has its own experiment with its own democracy, right? After they lost less of World War II, it really had that paradigm shift. Primarily triggered by the occupation by the Allied forces, but nonetheless, it really did go through its own transformation as a society and becoming the democratic nation that it is today. But at the same time, I think it does appreciate some of those the dilemma that many of these countries go through, and then I think especially when it comes to Southeast Asia. As a lot of these regional economies have begun to mature, there was also a self-generated desire for more open society, more open democracy in many of the countries that were frankly not as open and not as free. And Japan's I think direct engagement in that is way back when in 1990s in the Cambodia Peace Accord. The role that the Japan played very quietly to broker a peace at that time, to end that to conclude the civil war in the Cambodia, and pave the way toward the transition of the country. I think it's I think the first direct engagement in all this. And why did Japan did that? I think Southeast Asia has always been a very important region for Japan, economically, strategically, but then also there was a civic element of Japanese society to it that they really did care about the bringing up that region to more economically prospering and the more freer and more open societies. And even today, there are governmental efforts in those regions and beyond, but also Japan also has a quite active nonprofit activities in many of these areas. So I think Japan does have its own interest. It has a long history, even if it's not often advertised, of actively working at the civic and societal levels with the countries in the region.
Fantastic, thank you. We are over time, but thank you so much to the panelists, to Evan and Yuki for joining us from Washington, D.C., Sana for coming here, and again to the audience online and here for listening in. Please join me in thanking the panelists and covering such a wide range of issues and a conversation on the Indo-Pacific. Thank you again.